Let me just welcome you all again to our 53rd Annual Scholars Conference and to UT Dallas. My name is Nils Romer. I'm the Dean of the School of Arts and Humanities and Technology, and I'm the Director of the Ackerman Center for Holocaust Studies. See, together, that it just about has allowed to move 3 more chairs. So we're just getting there. This is really for us always a wonderful opportunity to start out the conference with one of our keynotes. This particular keynote has been made possible by the generosity of Michael and Elaine Jaffe. Who endowed this particular lecture series to allow us always to bring in one distinguished speaker to really start off the conference with the bigger theme. And so this year we're very fortunate that we've secured once again an exceptional individual, Martin Dean, who, when we spoke on Zoom or Team, like it is fashionable to do these days, said, oh my, that's a bigger assignment. When I said continuities and discontinuities, no less, 33, 38, and 1943. So we're really pleased that he took up this challenge to talk about all these things in one way, but also really to speak about these from the perspective of his unique expertise. But before we go there, let me just maybe say a few things about him and then lead into his actual lecture. Martin Dean got his PhD in history from Queen's College in Cambridge, in the UK, in other words, and then served as a research scholar for many years at the Holocaust Museum in Washington. Over the years, he built up a considerable body of work, in particular focusing on the Ukraine and on the kind of intricacies of this multi-ethnic place and the ways in which the Holocaust played itself out in that context. He also had an immense amount of his work dedicated to kind of the robbing and looting of Jewish property, as well as a key role in this multi-generational, multi-volume work on the encyclopedia of the various Jewish ghettos that the Holocaust Museum has put together. So Martin Dean, in many ways, is one of the many voices that really in the 90s compelled us all to recognize that geography in many ways adds on not just other facets to the history of the Holocaust, but in many ways brings in also an entirely different dynamic than the one that we more commonly had been accustomed to thinking about Berlin as the kind of center where all the decision-making occurred. And so with him and others, we ended up with far more complicated and intriguing histories of the Holocaust, and also with far more complicated histories of these various categories of victim, perpetrators, bystanders, and collaborators. So in many ways, we are, as I said, blessed to have him here with us today. Martin, if you want to join us.
Well, thank you first very much for the invitation, especially to the Jaffes and to Niels. It's a great honor to be here. And it is quite a challenging lecture today, so I'll try and take it slowly and explain things as I go along. The word Holocaust derives from the ancient Greek term for a religious sacrifice, an offering totally consumed by fire. Despite there being many critics of the term and arguments for alternatives such as Churban in Yiddish or Shoah in Hebrew and French, the term Holocaust has entered has endured in the English-speaking world today. I will argue that the term totally consumed by fire is in many respects accurate regarding the fate of Europe's Jews, as the fires of hatred and of erasure were stoked successively in the years 1933, 1938, and 1943. These 3 images of the burning of books in Berlin in 1933, of one of many synagogues being set on fire with people watching during Kristallnacht, and then finally also of the burning of the Warsaw Ghetto in April 1943, all demonstrate examples of physical destruction by fire during the Holocaust. These policies of destruction were accompanied by the establishment of concentration camps in 1933, which were then filled with 30,000 Jews in the wake of Kristallnacht in 1938. Then finally, from the summer of 1943, the gigantic network of some 1,000 concentration camps swallowed up those Jews selected for labor after the liquidation of the ghettos and forced labor camps for Jews. Indeed, the burning of books and synagogues led not only to the burning of ghettos in 1942 to 43, but also to the incineration of some 2 million Jews following the gassings at the extermination camps, including Auschwitz. However, many of the victims of the Holocaust by bullets were also burned and ground into dust during a massive campaign to erase even the last traces of mass murder called Operation 1005. Even today, through the impressive research of Andrei Angrick and other historians, we are only beginning to understand the massive scale of this cover-up, which ignited fires on funeral pyres all over Eastern Europe, after starting at the site of the largest mass shooting at Babin Yar in August 1943. So the years 1933, 1938, and 1943 all witnessed seismic shifts in Nazi policy that had a dramatic impact on the trajectory of the Holocaust. In elections, in July 1932, Adolf Hitler's Nazi Party broke through to become the strongest party represented in the Reichstag, such that Hitler stated he would only be satisfied with the position of Chancellor. In the view of historian Alan Bullock, with a voting strength of 13.7 million electors, a party membership of over 1 million, and a private army of 400,000 SA and SS, Hitler was the most powerful political leader in Germany, knocking on the doors of the Chancellery at the head of the most powerful political party Germany had ever seen. It still took another 6 months, but after some gains for the communists in the November 1932 elections and the failure of the governments of von Papen and Schleicher, President Paul von Hindenburg was persuaded to appoint Hitler the Chancellor of a conservative coalition government on January the 30th, 1933. On February 27th, the German Parliament building, the Reichstag in Berlin, burned down. The police arrested a Dutch worker, Marinus von der Lubbe, and he was subsequently executed for the crime. But without waiting for the investigation to be completed, the Nazis seized the opportunity to round up their communist and socialist political opponents, blaming them for the fire. In the ensuing election on March 5th, the Nazis won 44% of the vote, allowing them to gain a parliamentary majority with the support of the nationalists, who won 8%. Later in March, the Nazis passed the Enabling Act, which granted Hitler dictatorial powers to rule by decree during a self-declared national emergency. This remained the basis for Nazi rule until 1945. After the Nazi seizure of power, there was a massive increase in Nazi party membership, as many people joined for opportunistic career reasons, especially in the police and civil service. These people became known as the March converts, the Märzgefallenen. The Nazis still preferred those with a low party number who had joined the movement earlier, but accepted this influx as a means to further Nazify society. At the same time, other political parties and organizations were being dissolved. Children now joined the Hitler Youth, where they received a thorough indoctrination in Nazi beliefs and ideology. The large-scale boycott of Jewish businesses on April 1st served as an outlet for pent-up anti-Jewish hatred among Nazi activists. On April 1st, SA men were stationed outside Jewish stores, and placards warning, "Don't buy from Jews," were pasted on the windows. Here you see it even spelled out in English from a contemporary photograph. Although the boycott was widely observed, a few Germans made a point of visiting Jewish businesses to show solidarity. The boycott was called off shortly afterward, but Hitler retained the constant threat of reimposing it. This was the first of a wide array of economic measures directed against the Jews throughout the 1930s. On April 7th, the Nazis issued the law for the re-establishment of the professional civil service. This had the effect of dismissing about 5,000 Jewish civil servants, although initially war veterans were exempted. It also encompassed a wider purge of officials who were forced into compulsory retirement as the Nazis brought the civil service under their control. Subsequently, Jews were purged from other professions, such as doctors, lawyers, and pharmacists, as well as increasingly also from large-scale business. The law also raised the question of who was defined as a Jew. This was resolved more definitively by the Nuremberg Laws in 1935. On May 10th, members of the SA and the Hitler Youth burned around 20,000 books at Berlin's Opera Square, the Opernplatz. Among the authors whose works were destroyed were Thomas Mann, Erich Maria Remarque, the author of the anti-war All Quiet on the Western Front, Karl Marx, and Heinrich Heine. Prophetically, Heine had written in the early 19th century, "Where books are burned, in the end, people will also be burned." I mean, he was probably referring to the Catholic Church, which had also been burning Christians or burning people at an earlier period, but as you can see, it takes a very extreme form with the Nazis. In the first months of Nazi rule, there was considerable violence throughout Germany, mostly carried out by the SA, who were widely used as auxiliary policemen. These actions featured brutal beatings and gangster-like killings. Among the main targets were political opponents and persons against whom local Nazis had political or personal grudges. Among them were many Jews. On July 1st, there were 26,789 people being held in protective custody. Improvised concentration camps were established to hold these political detainees. So this is a map showing places of detention, and it was actually prepared by the kind of communist opposition from outside of Germany. The places marked K were these early concentration camps, most of which were dissolved soon afterwards. But of course, at the same time, they started setting up the main concentration camps, which became so infamous. To accommodate the many people seized in early March following the Reichstag fire, the Nazis established dozens of concentration camps. The first such camp was established at Nora in Thuringia by Gauleiter Saukel on March 3rd. These early camps were often makeshift, with guards comprising members of the SA and SS, but eventually they came under state control. For example, in Breslau, now Wrocław in Poland, the Nazis established a concentration camp for political protective custody prisoners on April 28th. Hundreds of political opponents of the Nazis were interned in a factory, warehouse in the Durgoy section of the city. The camp was created by SA Obergruppenführer Edmund Heiners, but administratively it came under the responsibility of the Breslau Police Presidium. On April 28, 1933, the first 120 protective custody prisoners were brought into the camp in a triumphal procession preceded by a band. More than 50,000 people were detained in some 100 early camps in 1933 to 34. The campsites ranged from a barge in one instance to workhouses, abandoned factories and castles, as well as sections of existing prisons. Most did not have barbed wire, barracks, or guard towers. The vast majority of these informal sites were closed by the end of 1934, as the SS developed a few large-scale concentration camps from the mid-1930s on the model of Dachau. So this is an aerial view of the Dachau camp, obviously taken in 1945, but you get the idea of a huge compound with barracks and parade squares, and of course guard towers and barbed wire around it. Dachau was established on March 20th, 1933, by Heinrich Himmler. It was based in a former munitions factory that could hold thousands of prisoners. The first prisoners at Dachau were communists, Many Jews were also sent to concentration camps in 1933 as political prisoners. The SS took over the camp on April the 11th and installed a regime of terror, treating Jewish prisoners especially brutally. By the end of May, 12 prisoners had been tortured to death or had committed suicide. In June 1933, SS Oberfuhrer Theodor Eicke was appointed the commandant. He was subsequently promoted to head the concentration camp executive. Under Eicke's command, Dachau became known as a school of violence, and many aspects of the concentration camp system were developed here from 1933. The camp itself was enlarged in 1937 to 38 in time for a large influx of Jewish prisoners after Kristallnacht. Whereas before 1933, Nazi violence was largely in opposition to the state, after 1933, the seizure of power gave the Nazis control over the state apparatus to pursue its goals of totalitarianism, militarization, and anti-Semitism. The first stage of this process was the merging of Nazi Party organizations with elements of the state, also known as coordination, or in German, Gleichschaltung. Almost immediately, members of the Stormtroops SA began patrolling together with the uniformed police, and the Nazis asserted control over regional police departments. In May 1933, Hitler effectively dissolved the trade unions, confiscating their property and bank accounts. The workers were co-opted into the German Labor Front, led by Robert Ley, which outlawed strikes. This gave the party a key role in managing industrial relations along corporatist lines like Mussolini. As propaganda minister, Joseph Goebbels closely oversaw the press and the film industry, censoring any criticism. In his ministry, he asserted the right of the party to direct the civil service, dismissing anyone who resisted. The decisive change in 1933 was that the Nazi Party was transformed from a mass movement into a ruling party, asserting totalitarian control over state and society. Continuity from the 1920s can be seen in the persistence and intensification of anti-Semitic campaigns, the dominance of Nazi propaganda, now enforced by censorship, and the escalation of political violence, now condoned and even implemented by a police state. How did Jews respond to these changes? While many were reluctant to recognize their full implications, 7% of Jews emigrated in 1933, the largest number of any year before 1938. Key developments with respect to the emergence of the Holocaust included the start of the state-sponsored economic plunder and legal discrimination against the Jews, demonstrated in the boycott and the civil service law. Meanwhile, the mass arrest of political opponents and the establishment of concentration camps saw the initiation of the administrative apparatus of terror, which was to become refined after 1938. So this is an image showing Jews in Vienna being forced to wash the pavements, and you see a number of mostly uniformed people, Nazis and others, essentially laughing and humiliating them. In 1938, Hitler's annexation of Austria accelerated anti-Jewish violence and discrimination. The registration of Jewish assets and the massive destruction of Kristallnacht revealed a dual strategy of economic pressure and physical intimidation to force Jews to emigrate. The first deportations and the mass incarceration of Jews in concentration camps in 1938 were significant forebodings of the key aspects of the Holocaust. The punitive tax and the introduction of forced labor for Jews reflected more aggressive legal measures. Following the Anschluss, Austrian Jews were grabbed by local Nazis and forced to clean the streets, often for days on end. One motive for this was to wipe away the slogans in favor of the Austrian leader Dollfuss, who had attempted to prevent Germany's annexation. Anti-Jewish violence, however, escalated to include beatings, robbery, and the seizure of Jewish businesses. Hundreds of Austrian Jews responded by committing suicide. More than 20,000 Jewish businesses were taken over by wild commissars in the first months of Nazi rule in Austria and systematically plundered. A major motive for the establishment of the Property Transfer Office, the Vermögenverkehrsstelle, in May 1938 was to regain state control over Aryanization from these wild commissars. Then in April 1938, as a result of an initiative in Austria, all Jews were obliged to register their property. This was immediately understood by both Nazis and Jews as the preparation for more widespread confiscation and further accelerated the sale of Jewish businesses. In May and June 1938, the Gestapo applied a further dose of terror, deporting 1,800 Austrian Jews to Dachau from Vienna. Historian Ilana Offenberger notes that for these men, their arrest was the most pivotal moment in their lives, as they were caught off guard by the sheer brutality of it. Raoul Klugman recalled, "The trip itself was a horror. They terrorized people on the train. You had to sit absolutely still. The minute you make the slightest move, they hit you." A sharp increase in Jewish emigration followed these arrests, reflecting both the increased efficiency of Eichmann's Central Office for Jewish Emigration and the Gestapo's terror methods. In October 1938, the Polish government denied Polish Jews living in Germany a right of return unless they obtained approval from the Polish consulate. In response, German authorities deported 15,000 Polish Jews to Poland in the last days of October 1938. Polish Jews were then detained for months in an improvised camp at Spąszyn on the Polish side of the border, where conditions were catastrophic. This was the first large-scale deportation of Jews organized by the Nazi authorities. Among those deported were the parents of Herschel Greenspan. In desperation, he assassinated the third secretary at the German consulate in Paris on November 7th, 1938, which led to the massive Nazi pogrom staged against the Jews on November 9th to 10th, 1938, known to us as Kristallnacht. It's used, that German term, because it involved also the massive smashing of shop windows, so destruction of the glass. The use of fire to destroy nearly 200 synagogues and the deliberate smashing of the windows in thousands of Jewish shops marked a coordinated attack on Jewish property throughout the Reich in an effort to purge the Jews. In the Sudetenland, taken from Czechoslovakia in October 1938, not only were synagogues burned, shops plundered, and people abused, more than half the Jewish population was driven out into the rump Czech state by December 1938. The terrible impact of Kristallnacht on German Jews can be grasped from the response of Shlomo Schwarzschild in Hamburg. Early in the morning of November 10th, on my way to morning prayers in the Bornplatz synagogue, I met old Mr. Schenkolewski. He told me that the synagogue had been set on fire, the windows smashed, the interior devastated. When I arrived, I saw an assembled crowd. The younger ones seemed to be enjoying the spectacle. Others stood in silence with grave looks. Some grinned and gloated. Thick black smoke streamed out of broken windows. Torn up Torah scrolls and prayer books lay in ruins. On this morning, at this spot, time came to a standstill for me. This was the traumatic end of my childhood. A few days later, I returned to Bornplatz. I put my beret in my pocket so as not to be identified as a Jew. I wanted more than anything to take something as a memento. I picked up a fragment of colored glass from the ruins. Today it hangs framed with a picture of the Bornplatz synagogue above my bed at home in Haifa. So this is the image of another burning synagogue in Oberarnstadt near Frankfurt. And here again you see the onlookers with a variety of different expressions, but it obviously wasn't a secret. Literally, millions of Germans came out to see what was going on the streets, and had some of them were egging on the perpetrators. The curiosity, indifference, and glee of assembled onlookers can be seen also in this photograph. As reported by the head of the Sicherheitsdienst, the Nazi intelligence service, Reinhard Heydrich, to Hermann Göring in mid-November 1938. 191 synagogues were set on fire, another 76 completely destroyed. Some 20,000, in reality 30,000 Jews were arrested and sent to concentration camps. What this looked like at the local level can be seen from the example of Regensburg, where Jewish stores and homes were destroyed and plundered. Around 220 Jews were arrested and held at the local police station. After being marched through the city streets, many of the men were deported to Dachau. One man was beaten to death during his arrest. Nearly 30,000 Jewish men were arrested and taken into protective custody by the SS at the three main concentration camps of Buchenwald, Dachau, and Sachsenhausen. So this is an aerial image of the Sachsenhausen concentration camp, I think taken a little later in the 1930s. But actually the interesting thing here is you can see how close it is to just normal neighborhoods, residential streets, and also obviously some forests around there. And so the camps, both the concentration camps and other forced labor camps in Germany, this was not any secret to the German people. It was, you knew very much what was going on. There were so many of the forced labor camps, more than 30,000 altogether for the foreign workers, that no German could be unaware of what was going on. This mass influx of 30,000 Jews overwhelmed the capacity of the concentration camps. Other prisoners noted the special treatment meted out to the Jews. Within months, more than 400 Jewish men had died in the camps. Then a surprising thing happened. Most of the Jewish prisoners were released in the weeks and months following their arrest. Of 10,000 Jews in Buchenwald in November 1938, only 1,534 remained at the start of 1939. Many were released on the strict condition that they sell their business and emigrate. In September 1939, only 1,500 Jews remained in concentration camps. Therefore, official concentration camps contained relatively few Jews during the height of the final solution between 1941 to 43, when Jews were confined primarily in over 1,000 ghettos and even more forced labor camps for Jews. In a key speech given by Hermann Göring at the Air Ministry on November 12, 1938, he outlined his plans for the rapid Aryanization of Jewish property. He also imposed a 1 billion Reichsmark fine or punitive tax on the Jews in the form of a property tax based on the earlier property census. Ultimately, Jews had to pay 25% of their wealth in 5 three-monthly installments. Jews were forced to sell off many of their possessions to meet the tax, resulting in rapid impoverishment. Another major change in December 1938 was the shift in policy to send Jews to work in forced labor camps. This was related to their worsening financial plight. Hermann Göring argued that those Jews who have no job and are healthy and able to work and who have no property will be assembled in labor columns. They don't need to be concentration camps. Here they will receive food, a bit of pocket money, and we will keep them in labor camps. As a result, by May 1939, more than 13,000 Jews were subjected to forced labor, and dozens of labor camps for Jews were created throughout Austria and Germany. For example, 2 forced labor camps for Jews were established in Landkreis Steinfurt at Lahr and Dumpter in December 1938. A post-war report concluded, the Dumpter camp was located on the edge of the town of Borghorst. In 1934 or 35, 2 camps were built to house emergency repair workers. Both camps were filled at the end of 1938 with Jews who had been assigned by the Labor Office in Rheine as emergency workers, and subsidies were paid by the Labor Office. The Jews were engaged in land drainage work for the Water Authority in Steinfurt, which was responsible for the accommodation, food, and payment of the Jews. So this actually was done by regular German civilian agencies, not necessarily by the SS or German police. Subsequently, the model of forced labor camps for Jews was applied on a massive scale throughout the occupied territories, encompassing some 2,000 camps, or twice the number of concentration camps. Security was generally less severe in these camps, although working conditions were very harsh, and in the occupied East, those unfit for work were periodically shot. Just need to get some water. Key changes with respect to Jewish policy in 1938, with the start of deportations, mass incarceration of Jews in concentration camps, and the introduction of forced labor. The goal remained primarily to force Jews to emigrate through terror measures and harsh economic policies. Yet the burning of synagogues and imposition of an extortionate property tax made it clear to all Jews that they would face destruction if they were to remain in Germany, and emigration increased considerably in 1939, before the war closed off the possibility of escape. In 1943 started with the German military defeat at Stalingrad, where the German Sixth Army surrendered at the end of January. This was a decisive turning point in the war in the East. The Nazi leadership responded on February 18th. Effectively acknowledging that Germany was not yet fully mobilized, Joseph Goebbels challenged his audience, "Do you want total war?" He also linked Germany's struggle against international Jewry with the war effort, thereby exhorting the German people to conduct total war against the Jews. Later in May, Hitler reinforced this message in a series of speeches, stressing Jewish responsibility for the war and promising that they would be made to pay the price. So this is an image of part of the Warsaw Ghetto burning in April 1943. You see, obviously, a lot of smoke and fire. In 1943, the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising and revolts in the extermination camps demonstrated the power of Jewish resistance. Now they knew the awful scale of Nazi genocidal plans, and this was not completely new, as there had been a number of revolts in smaller ghettos in 1942, which often resulted in the burning of the ghetto. In Warsaw, the SS responded with its full destructive force, effectively obliterating the entire ghetto area. At his trial after the war in Warsaw, the commander of the ghetto's suppression, Jürgen Stroop, noted, "When Himmler ordered the immediate destruction of the ghetto, it was difficult to decide how to do it. Because of the fire I mentioned before, an SS expert from the Warsaw Construction Department advised me that it would be useful to burn down all the houses so that later it would be easier to tear down the walls and to clear away the bricks and stones." So there was a really a deliberate policy of just destroying everything that was in the Warsaw ghettos. You'll see in a moment. This is one of several aerial photographs I'm using today, and you can see here that the entire ghetto area is pretty much wiped out. The only thing you can see, maybe I can highlight this. Just wondering if that will work. No. Yeah. Does that work? No. Yeah. So here you can see that there's something like a concentration camp. These are barracks still probably erected after the destruction of the ghetto, and they did, in fact, establish a concentration camp on the Warsaw Ghetto site for clearing it up. So the only buildings that remained were for the concentration camp, where prisoners worked salvaging bricks from the ghetto ruins. In 1943, the last remaining ghettos in Eastern Europe, such as those in Białystok and Minsk, were liquidated. For example, the SS and police leader for Eastern Galicia, Friedrich Katzmann, reported that by June 23rd, 1943, all ghettos in the region had been dissolved. As his report confirms, in many places, the Jews were brutally driven out of their hiding places using fire as a deadly weapon. For example, in Yavorov, Nazi SS and police forces destroyed the ghetto on April 16th. A few Jews capable of work were selected in the burned-out synagogue, and the ghetto area was destroyed by fire as the Germans and their collaborators flushed out those in hiding. Another 20,000 Jews working in forced labor camps in Galicia were murdered in the summer of 1943. After the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, heightened security concerns about Jews held in ghettos and labor camps prompted Himmler to order any remaining Jewish labor detachments to be moved into concentration camps for greater security. As a result, many forced labor camps and some ghetto locations were converted into or declared to be concentration camps. Yet this process took time and was not completed until late 1944. In the Warthegau, for example, in a coordinated operation, the SS closed all remaining labor camps, so more than 50 or so, and their Jewish laborers were sent to Auschwitz in August 1943, where they were selected for continued work or the gas chambers. Jews distributed among smaller labor detachments in Latvia were also transferred to SS control in the newly established Riga Kaiserwelt concentration camp system in the fall of 1943. This followed Himmler's orders in the summer of 43 for the ghettos in the Baltic states to be closed and the Jews collected in concentration camps. Subsequently, more than 20,000 Jewish prisoners were evacuated from the Baltic states to the Stutthof concentration camp by the fall of 1944. In Silesia, at least 28 of the forced labor camps for Jews there, and there were more than 170 of those, were converted into concentration camp subcamps, while the others were dissolved with the prisoners capable of work sent to concentration camps. This consolidation was due to the extra security only available in the concentration camps, where they had barbed wire and towers and stronger guards. When the forced labor camp at Bunzlau was converted into a subcamp of Gross-Rosen, the inmates recalled that the SS took away their civilian clothing and issued them with striped uniforms. At the same time, around half the prisoners deemed too weak to work were murdered by the SS. Therefore, concentration camps once again became the main repository for Jewish laborers in the last years of the war. Tens of thousands of Jews entered the German concentration camps from the summer of 43 until the end of 1944. A surprising result was that despite considerable losses on death marches and from the murderous conditions in the camps, around 200,000 Jews survived the Holocaust inside the Nazi camp system, where the Allies liberated them in 1945. So now I'll talk briefly about a little bit of my work on Babin Yar, where again I was using a lot of aerial photographs and ground photographs. Just to explain this image, which seems more or less incomprehensible, like a moon landscape. This is the so-called sand quarry in Babin Yar, where pictures of clothing were taken in the 2 or 3 days after the mass shooting. And then by 1943, it had actually become what you might call a sub-camp of the work education camp at Sirets, which itself was only just at the other end of Babin Yar, the other end of the shooting ravine, as I tend to call it. I'll just show a few things on the screen here. So you may not see it very clearly, but this is two bunkers here. You can just see the shadow of one here, and this is another bunker here. And this actually, in my view, is the shadow of a guard tower, which has probably been moved from the Sirets camp to here. And we know that this is what we are seeing here because 15 Jewish prisoners managed to escape from these bunkers, and they told their story after the war. And they describe exactly that opposite the entrance, so here you see the entrance of the two bunkers, there's like a step down which casts a shadow. There was a guard tower with a machine gun. And unfortunately, when they tried to escape, or when they escaped in the middle of the night, the machine gun jammed, and so a number of Jews were able to escape and then make their way mostly down the ravine to hide in the brick factory at the end of Babin Yar ravine. But I'm going to talk now about why they were in those bunkers. In 1943, another new initiative in connection with the Holocaust got underway. In this image, we can see two bunkers that were created by the SS at Babin Yar to hold 300 prisoners who worked there in August and September of 1943. Their work is described by a former prisoner. We carried on digging this ditch and wondered what we were doing. Then we struck something that seemed like firm ground, but it turned out to be corpses. Some prisoners were taken to the Jewish cemetery and brought back headstones and iron railings. We had to make a flat area 10 meters by 10 meters and placed the stones and railings in a checkerboard pattern so that a grating for the ashes was created. Then layers of corpses and wood for burning were placed on top, and petrol was poured over it. In one such oven, between 2,000 and 2,500 corpses were piled up. It was lit simultaneously from all sides. At first, there was thick black smoke, but then it burned without smoke. We were forced to grind up the bones that remained intact and sift them through a sieve before the resulting powder was scattered. More than 50 such furnaces were lit up successively at Babyn Yar, each sending black smoke into the air, visible from Kiev. Each fire burned for 2 days. A local resident recalled, "You could see the columns of smoke from our house. There was a strong burning smell, the smell of burning human flesh, the burning of corpses. It lasted at least 1 month." This marked the start of Special Operation 1005, led by Paul Blobel, the same man who had organized the mass shootings at Babyn Yar 2 years before. As the extensive research of historian Andrei Angrick has shown, from 1943, hundreds of mass graves across Eastern Europe were exhumed, the bodies burned, and the traces covered over. Alarmed by Soviet propaganda about mass graves that had been liberated, the SS now sought to erase the crime scenes. Ironically, from some sites such as Babyn Yar, it is the investigation of this cover-up which can provide new insights into the original mass shootings. The bodies of many Jews killed by shooting were also burned, just as Germany itself was being consumed by fire. So there were literally hundreds of these sites where bodies were exhumed. To give a few examples, in Lviv, behind the Yanovska camp, also in places like Minsk, quite a lot in the Baltic states, Chelm, there was a very big exhumation there. So most of the large mass shootings, they didn't find all the smaller ones, so I have been to some exhumations done in the 1990s before Jewish organizations decided this was not a very good idea anymore. But we did find bodies in some of the smaller mass shooting sites in Ukraine, but most of the larger ones were dug up, and they literally sort of went back to the commanders who'd been in charge of the mass shootings to find out where those locations were. And almost always either Jewish prisoners or Soviet POWs were used for these exhumations and burnings, and then the prisoners themselves were shot. So it's only in a few cases we have this kind of detailed evidence. On October the 4th, 1943, SS leader Heinrich Himmler gave a speech in Poznan to a select group of SS leaders in which he discussed the murder of the Jews. "We shall now discuss it completely openly among ourselves. Nevertheless, we shall speak of it in public. We shall never speak of it in public. I mean the evacuation of the Jews, the extermination of the Jewish race." So they were openly admitting it to each other, but of course this was never supposed to get out. Here, the coordinated effort to murder all Jews is openly admitted in private by the SS while being covered up and erased in public. So this is an aerial view of the Travniki camp, and you can see roughly the places where the barracks used to be. Actually, this is taken in 1944, so the barracks have now, that's where the grass has grown, whereas the places where people were walking all the time, no grass has grown up. So it's kind of interesting how you get a kind of shadow of what the camp was like. Some buildings still remained. I'm trying to recall if part of this was burned or not. Certainly the bodies were burned here afterwards. And the Poniatova camp, they actually killed some of the Jewish prisoners there by burning down one of the barracks with people inside. And that was common at a number of different camps in Eastern Europe. It wasn't the main method, but there's a ghetto, I think, in Belarus, several ghettos in Belarus, where they used burning, much as they did often with the civilian population. They'd push people into a barn and then set it on fire. So this was a method commonly used, although not the main method, of course. So on October the 14th, 1943, the prisoners at Sobibor overpowered some of the guards and organized the mass escape of 300 Jews. Ultimately, only some 50 Jews survived, but the revolt forced the SS to close the Sobibor extermination camp. 5 days later, Hans Frank stated in Krakow that the camps with Jews in the general government constituted a great danger, and that the escape of the Jews from one of these camps, Sobibor, proved it. Soon afterwards, Heinrich Himmler issued orders for Operation Harvest Festival, which entailed the mass shooting of more than 40,000 Jews from forced labor camps on November the 3rd to 4th, 1943, including most of those evacuated from the Warsaw Ghetto in April. So the main three camps were Majdanek, Poniatowa, and Trewniki, but quite a few Jews were brought in from other camps like Dorohucha or some of the camps around Lublin, so that the total number of Jews was more than 40,000. And the vast majority of these were actually Jews who'd been evacuated from the Warsaw Ghetto just before the start of the uprising in April 43. It's something that's not so well known, but about 30,000 or more Jews were transferred to factories elsewhere in Lublin just before the Warsaw Ghetto uprising. In the weeks after the mass shootings in these three camps, the bodies were then burned to conceal evidence of these crimes. In line with the changing fortunes in the war, there was not only increasing Jewish resistance, but also more support for Jews. Following Italy's decision to change sides in the war, the Germans were unable to implement their plans for the deportation of Danish Jews, so that 7,000 Jews fled from Denmark to Sweden, assisted by Danish rescuers and their boats. In October 1943, Reichsmarshal Hermann Göring informed the labor offices of the impending call-up of first-degree Mischlinge, men excluded from the military, and Aryans married to full Jewish women for compulsory labor service with the Todt organization, the OT. In practice, this decree was not implemented until 1944, when the Labor Administration sent men from both these groups for construction work under the OT. Ultimately, around 20,000 men classified as from or in mixed marriages were sent to more than 100 labor camps in Germany. Thus, forced labor was now extended to those previously protected from anti-Jewish measures by their ties to the German racial community. So just briefly to summarize, what remained constant was the barrage of anti-Semitic propaganda that intensified, if anything, as the tide of war turned against Nazi Germany after Stalingrad. Two major changes were the shift of Jewish labor back into the concentration camps, as well as attempts to burn evidence of the Holocaust in response to increased Jewish resistance and enemy propaganda, respectively. From book burnings in 1933 to the torching of synagogues in 1938, and then the incineration of corpses on a massive scale, the Holocaust as destruction by fire remained one consistent theme during the evolution of Nazi anti-Jewish policy from 1933 through 1938 to 1943 and beyond. Thank you.
You just raise your arm, then you will get one of the mics. One is there, right? Maybe you have the other one? One's there. Staying for a moment.
Thank you, Dr. Dean. Amazing presentation. I was just fascinated by what you just mentioned about the Mischlinge and also the mixed marriages. Could you say a little bit more about how that was implemented and what the criteria were?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, with Jews in mixed marriages, it is a very complicated story, and there are different aspects to it. A lot of them actually did serve in the German army at the start of the war, but then they were kind of combed out again, pretty much once the war against Russia started, around that time. And historian Brian Rigg has done a very kind of big investigation of this group of Jews who actually served in the Wehrmacht. They were protected from deportation if they were married to a German or if they were from mixed parentage. But then you do see, pretty much in line with this escalating propaganda against Jews in 1943, especially in the Western European countries, they start taking measures against so-called Mischlinge there. And then in Germany, it's in 1944, they set up, initially some of them are actually sent to France, where they're working in construction sites there. But most are sent to camps in Germany. Just to give you some examples, these were mostly fairly small camps, only 100 or so people together. One group was sent, I think, from Stuttgart. They would kind of get a letter from the labor office to report to the railway station, so they weren't necessarily under close guard. And of course, many people in Germany were being forcibly recruited for other types of labor, so it wasn't really like being in concentration camps. But they were in these labor camps, often alongside other foreign workers. So there was one big camp in North Germany where there were lots of other types of workers in the neighboring camps, and often they would sort of be compared with the other foreign laborers. Some groups they were treated better than, but often they were treated worse than even the foreign laborers. Another camp was near Leipzig, and there they kind of observed the bombing, I think, near Dresden. Sorry, they saw the bombing of Dresden while they were in that labor camp. But some of these people were also sent to Theresienstadt towards the end of the war. And of course, the risky thing to do was actually not to sign up for forced labor. Then you'd have to go underground, and some of those people who didn't go to forced labor were then actually treated worse than those who did. So most of those in these forced labor camps did survive the war, but a few were sent to concentration camps, either for resisting or for contrary behavior when they were in these camps. But it's not so well known because it happens at the very end of the war, and surprisingly, a lot of these things, the German records are not very good, but what we do get are testaments by survivors. So from things like the Schur Foundation and especially the ITS, you can piece together this story. But it's really something that's not been done systematically. I have a list of about 100 camps I found, but there probably are more. There's a bit of information in East German archives. Often they were under kind of the organization Todt was the thing that was in charge of them. And these were mostly projects either creating new factories or other kind of infrastructure projects doing heavy labor. But it's certainly something that needs to be documented further as it's not so well known.
Thank you, Dr. Dean. Fascinating presentation. I'm curious if you could speak a little bit about the changes in sort of organizational and personnel in the implementation of each of these measures over the course of the 3 dates that you focused on.
Right. I'm not sure I can piece that all together, but the thing to stress is often the SS and the Gestapo are not always completely in control, even some of the most important things in the Holocaust. So obviously, Goering does play a big role in the financial exploitation in the early 30s, and a lot of these labor camps, both initially in Germany, are done by regular civilian agencies, again with little sort of Nazi direct intervention. And even later on in the occupied territories, a number of different agencies are involved in exploiting Jewish labor, not just the SS, but things like drainage organizations. In the Warthegau, you have a number of different camps, often either run by the local German administration there, or sometimes by the party. Sometimes it's economic organizations have their own role, like the Organisation Todt. But the railroad construction, there you have camps. The camps themselves are often run by the construction companies, and they're borrowing the workers from the SS. So there is a whole kind of integrated network of different organizations where the SS is just one among many and not always the one with who are in charge. Of course, when it comes to the extermination, then it's usually the SS that step in and organize that. That's clear. But for quite long periods, other non-SS agencies are administering Jewish labor in particular.
Thank you for a wonderful presentation. My question is, as students of the Holocaust, what are some research avenues you feel need more exploration? What are some things you wish would be researched further?
That's a great question, and I mean, it seems surprising. You'd think we would know everything there is to know about the Holocaust. I think certainly Eastern Europe, there's still a whole vast amount of work to be done on, especially the smaller ghettos, the relationships with non-Jewish local populations. Jews in hiding is another difficult thing to research. Obviously, in the West, we think we know everything, but sometimes I think these large-scale construction projects, how they were organized, and the sort of role of Jewish labor there. They say there were also in Western Europe several camps for Jews in mixed marriages or Mischlinge. Some of those Jews were then later deported, so we don't really know the history of the camps because the people didn't really survive. This is often the problem. And even in Germany itself, I was kind of stunned to find there are literally hundreds of these local labor camps in Germany about which very little is known. And sometimes the best way to research that is actually through whatever you can find from survivors, because there's not so much in the German archives. Another good source is actually these sort of compensation claims. Often they even have, some of the reports I'm quoting are from the Germans themselves. They didn't really believe Jews who told them these stories, and they did an investigation, and they found, oh yes, we have records of this. This did actually happen. But it's sort of so diverse, it's hard to imagine. And another group of camps that are hard to describe are the Hakshara camps, which were initially set up by Jews preparing for emigration, and these were again instrumentalized in countries like Austria by the Nazis to sort of contain the Jews, and one of their aims with labor camps was to sort of weaken resistance by putting the men to hard labor so that the families didn't have any kind of male members to organize resistance. And the same thing happens in the ghettos as well, that even in some of the ghettos in Ukraine, I just published an article on forced labor camps in Ukraine for Jews, and again, I found more than 100 in Reichskommissariat Ukraine, not just building roads, but quite a lot in agriculture. And then just as the ghettos were being liquidated, often the Jews would either be brought back to the ghettos or sometimes shot in these camps. Even in Cherkasy, in the central region of Ukraine, there was about 30 camps there. Some of them had Jews brought in from Transnistria, but even after they liquidated the few ghettos in that region, the labor camps still existed for another 6 months or so. So these are kind of things that people just haven't known to look for because they're not mentioned in the Einsatzgruppen reports, and even the Soviet Extraordinary Commission reports are not very good. But if you start reading the testimonies and the Schur Foundation information, especially ITS, although ITS is not so good for the former Soviet units, better for everything that was in Poland or further west. But these new sources give us lots of things to work on today.
Thank you, Dr. Dean. You talked a lot about mass murder through burning, and I was just wondering, is that, someone just asked about research. When you think about the Inquisition, the synagogues that were burned, Martin Luther, who said synagogues should be burned, Jewish homes should be burned, and then the burning in the Holocaust. Is there some kind of a pattern, like maybe a religious pattern, or is it just the most convenient way of mass murder, through burning? So
that's a good question, and it definitely needs more research. My view is it's obviously not the main method, but it's kind of one of the most public forms of destruction that they engage in. Sort of Kristallnacht then sets the scene for much more murderous burnings of synagogues in places like Białystok and Riga and Kovel, where people are actually inside when the synagogues are burned. And as I say, this is then extended to the burning of barns, which is not generally used against Jews, but there are some places where Jews are destroyed by fire in the sort of second wave of mass shootings in 1942 and 1943. Even some of the labor camps, often when there's sort of resistance, then they will resort to mass to burning. And the same with the ghettos. Many of the ghettos were burned down. One in Slonim, I actually had the testimony of a fireman who was ordered to go around to sort of stop the fire from spreading to non-Jewish houses, but he was not allowed to sort of try and extinguish a fire in houses where Jews were being burned. And there are several, well, certainly a number of ghettos where occasionally the Jews would actually use it as a kind of distraction. So at the Nezvish ghetto, it seems the Jews actually set the fire to distract the mainly Belarusian guards so they could escape. So it is a complicated dynamic, but the number of cases is quite large, and especially this idea that everybody sees it and that it's a very sort of public event applies again to these ghetto burnings.
As you said, a lot of these events were well known to the German populace. So how well was this known outside of Germany and Eastern Europe, other European countries or the United States, both by the average citizen and by the governments?
Well, interestingly, there were large protests In America, both in 1933 and in 1938, these things were well documented and well known. And so it's not something that was a secret. And I think that was, even in Germany, the burning of synagogues was kind of really trying to bring the German people on board with this beginning of the Holocaust. Obviously, not many people were killed, although more than 100 people were killed on Kristallnacht. But it kind of makes the Germans complicit. And so the point I'm really making is that the claims by Germans that they knew nothing about this at all are nonsense. Of course, not everybody knew the full details of the killings and how they were conducted. There is a very interesting work by Bernward Dörner, a German historian. He looked at court cases dealing with the Heimtücke-Gesetz, which is essentially people accused of defaming Nazi leaders. And he found that the knowledge of the details of the Holocaust that was revealed in these court cases going on in 1942, 43, 44 is kind of, it certainly lays bare the lie that we knew nothing, that people had a pretty good idea what was going on. And as I was saying before, with the concentration camps and the other camps in Germany, people were aware what they were. People didn't want to get sent to concentration camps. They knew what a concentration camp was. And they'd seen this mounting campaign against the Jews. They saw their neighbors being rounded up and disappearing. In places like Amsterdam, you have a big transport wagon comes up to your Jewish neighbor's house the day after he's taken away. So it's something that everybody's aware of in one form or another. Of course, they didn't know necessarily the exact fate, but when you don't get any letters coming back, I looked at this actually with the property records. That's something that's quite interesting. The extent they would go to try and establish. Initially, when people were deported, the people trying to evaluate and sell off the Jewish property, they would send letters to try and find out what had happened to the Jews, just to be sure. And of course, the Gestapo soon put a stop to this, but it showed that some information was flowing back and forth.
I think he has a question, please.
You mentioned the Gleichschaltung and the top-down creation of a system within Germany where everything's devoted towards the goals of the Nazi Party. But could you also talk about the role of Selbstgleichschaltung, or the people themselves from the bottom up adapting themselves to Nazi policy, and how that led to increasingly harsher policies up to 1938?
It's just going through my mind what's happening in Russia now. It's the same sort of thing, that people adjust to what they have to adjust to, that not many people are going to put their necks on their line. Of course, there were people who were more enthusiastic, and this was the thing the Nazis offered, that you would get promotion, you would get kind of respect in your community by doing these things. And some people talk about good Nazis, people who sort of stayed in place to try and prevent worse things happening, but the problem is that you have very little power to stop this, that the people who do try and stop it tend to have it come to a bad end. But of course there were, in the 1940s, a few occasions where Germans did quite a lot to protect Jews, but these are very much the exceptions, much as is sadly also true in Poland. The number of rescuers is greatly outnumbered by the number of people spreading anti-Semitic propaganda and rumors.
Hi, I'm Christine Maxwell, and it's so overwhelming every time one hears about many aspects of the camps. And it's just continues to sort of devastate me. But what do you want us to take away? There is so much. If you said, okay, I'm walking out of here, what do you want me to take away from what you said today?
I think what I try to do is to show that this really happened, that people, I mean, it is almost inconceivable, and that's something I want to kind of work against, just to show that these are, people make decisions, people are involved, so you have to know what's going on around you and sort of fight against it if you see something that needs stopping. So I think that's the message. For me, of course, I'm trying to find out exactly what happened, trying to get as much detail. You don't necessarily need to know all that detail, but the important thing is that it really happened. So the voices of the survivors are very important to sort of have their stories recognized, and the people can see that this is not some sort of great myth. This really did affect people in very bad ways. And one thing I tried to do today is see the kind of discontinuity from the perspective of the Jews. When was the moment when they suddenly said, well, this is really bad, I either have to get out of here or kind of my whole life has changed. And you do see some of these early events do have that kind of trigger going off inside them.
One of my primary research interests is the plunder within the concentration camps. You know, all of the property that the Jewish victims brought with them that was then plundered after they were sent to the gas chambers. I mean, I've come across, you know, a lot of references to that in survivor testimonies, but how much, I'm curious as to how much documentation there is, you know, among like the Nazi camp records or whatever other documentation, like how much is there that, you know, records that type of plunder? Do you know, or?
It is a useful source. I mean, in the Nuremberg trials there's like a huge report on the whole effect of the what they call Operation Reinhardt, and it has literally something like 176 million Reichsmarks is sent back, and I have written several articles on this. Sort of, you can piece together not the whole system, but large parts of it from various different sources. There were even some Nazi investigations of kind of corruption, and those again reveal that individuals were kind of helping themselves from this massive amount of plunder. Strangely, Himmler himself was trying to prove to Hitler, well, we're not plundering, this is all going to the German state. So he did actually document in a lot of detail, particularly the valuables taken from the Jews and what happened to it. But other people have looked at, say, the silverware, which was confiscated in 1938-39. Early 39, there was an order, Jews had to give up their silverware. A lot of that goes to the big companies like Degussa, and it's in their records if you go to the archives. So surprisingly, the plunder is a good way to find out more about the Holocaust, because often those kind of records dealing with property are kept. The other thing you can do, which is interesting, that the German tax offices were the main offices concerned with winding up Jewish property, and they kept like a thick file on every individual Jewish family that had some property. So those are still available in Berlin as well, and it can be very kind of disturbing to read them, but you have this very dry property information, but it's somebody's life, and you can match it up with other sources and understand what happened. And what's often underestimated is how rapidly Jews are impoverished, particularly from 38 to 40. If you tried to emigrate, then about 50% of your property was lost in what's called the flight tax. And actually, in terms of continuity, that's a very interesting thing, that there was something like that in some German principalities in the 18th century, that if you left a German state to go to another one, they took like half your property away from you. So it's not something new in the German kind of idea, but of course it was applied very specifically against the Jews in the 1930s. Most Germans who say wanted to emigrate to America, they could get an exemption from this tax by applying for it. But the scale of property confiscation was really massive, so that most Jews by 1940 already had exhausted most of their reserves. And the other thing that's not so well known is that they blocked Jewish bank accounts from really the end of 1939, beginning of 1940. Anyone with any kind of large amount in their bank account was only allowed to take out a certain amount each month to sort of pay their rent, and that was about it. So even though they had money, they still couldn't spend it.
I'm curious to know how much the correspondence by Allied forces, American soldiers, are used in explaining the period understanding, the slightly later period.
I mean, you get some quite important insights from the post-war correspondence. I haven't used it so much, but even things like, I was looking at OSS records recently, and it's not focused on the Holocaust, but every now and then you get something mixed up there, which is very revealing. They did quite detailed analysis of the various Nazi organizations, and sometimes that has information you won't find elsewhere. They got to interrogate Nazis soon after they were captured. And actually what's interesting is a lot of Jews were with the liberating forces, and they took particular interest in this. Some of them became legal experts for restitution after the war, and their kind of papers can be very revealing, so that's another great source.
In all of this, you haven't talked about what was the role of the church and clergymen. How did they rationalize standing by, or did they not stand by?
The church is actually complicated. I'm not an expert on that. There were so-called Nazi priests or brown peace priests who who kind of swallowed some of the Nazi propaganda and spread it in countries like Poland. The Catholic Church was a major engine of anti-Semitism in different ways, although individual priests did help Jews there. It's a very mixed story. You have people like Niemöller who stood up and were counted if a little too late. And you have also there was a concordat between Hitler and the Pope, much as Mussolini made one, trying to kind of regulate relations between church and state, which had always been complicated in Germany as well as Italy. But actually, Hitler does persecute the Catholic Church and takes a lot of property away from them in the 1930s, and priests are put in jail for so-called currency offenses. So it's very complicated. And the Nazis themselves, most of them were anti-religious, and they wanted their SS members to leave the churches, but there were also some German Protestant churches which were Nazified in a way. So to tell the whole story, I would need another lecture at least, I think.
So always another opportunity. Let me also maybe ask one other question, just to kind of come back again to this 33, 38, 43. 43 obviously is also the 10th anniversary of 33. So in many ways, in January, there are various festive speeches reminding again of the 10th anniversary of Hitler coming to power. So in many ways, this is a festive celebration that coincides, however, with the official admittance of defeat at Stalingrad, and then, as you said, the kind of follows up upon this kind of declaration of total war. But on the other side, so that would suggest like celebration and kind of confidence and kind of continuation. But then on the other side, I was struck by your presentation, the kind of, you put a lot of emphasis on the Operation 1005 and then on Himmler's speech. And they seem to like suggest rather that there's something that in their minds has come to an end, right? That there's a kind of, now we've accomplished all of this and now we're trying to destroy all of its evidence. Yeah. So do you think that there's kind of in terms of the expectation where one respectively is in the war and in the midst of the Holocaust, that there's something to be said about this kind of beginning of the cover-up, that there is a kind of growing realization that the end might be in sight?
I mean, the cover-up is obviously driven by the fact that they're losing territory,
Right.
and it's like what you see in Ukraine. When the Russians retreat, then they leave behind all these corpses, and people get very suspicious. So, and actually, I was looking at Srebrenica just the other day. The same thing happens there, that once the Allies start sort of focusing, or the NATO starts focusing on Srebrenica in the negotiations, they then move the corpses from one place to another in Srebrenica to try and cover that up. So it's a normal reaction to try and cover things up. But of course, this is the Nazis had never believed that they would be defeated. So this is kind of a shock to them. And so these responses, you see that even the Posen speech in some ways is kind of justify something, as he knows that they have got to do this cover-up. But I think they by that stage, of course, they're about 75–80% complete with their program, other than the Hungarian Jews. Most of Polish Jewry has been murdered there. And they did have deadlines. So the initial deadline for the general government was December 42. Then, of course, in Galicia, there were just too many, so that becomes the summer of 43. And then after that, it's just the ones in labor camps. In some ways, the starting to lose the war does probably mean that they don't take the next step, which is destroying all the Jews in labor camps, that there are, as I say, many Jews in concentration camps at the end of the war. And because they're dispersed all over the place and mixed up with other non-Jewish prisoners, it makes it harder just to sort of eliminate them that way without people noticing. So the concentration camps, in a very peculiar way, are the place where a few Jews do survive in the end.
Thank you so much. So, on Kristallnacht, I understand that immediately after the Germans charged the Jews for cleanup, for the damage that they caused.
Yeah.
How did they get that money?
As I say, through a tax.
Pardon me?
Through a tax.
Through a tax. So
The tax offices collected the money, as they would, it's not quite payroll deduction, but a similar sort of mechanism.
like a payroll deduction?
Well, not strictly. You would get a bill based on your previous property census. The problem is, of course, many Jews had sold things in the meantime, so they tried to negotiate reductions, but essentially 25% of whatever you owned, you had to pay. So generally, it was things like stocks and shares got just kind of transferred from your ownership to the state's ownership.
But people weren't even working at this point, right? I mean, they were, you know, they lost their jobs, so there couldn't have been much out of that payroll part. Did they just go into their checking accounts and?
Well, they say they blocked the accounts in 1939, once the war started. That was a little bit later. I mean, the tax itself was like any other tax. You get a bill and you're given a certain time to pay it, and if you don't pay it, then you start getting penalties. So people did, yeah.
Then please all join me one more time and thank our wonderful speaker.